Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's continue our discussion in abnormal psychology with our chapter on personality disorders. Okay, and where are we? Right here. Okay, so regarding personality disorders, we will go through the major types of disorders. I'll go through some case studies and try and distinguish um, the different personality disorders from each other because there is a certain degree of overlap, yeah, in the characteristics of different personality disorders. And that's actually one of the tricky things and challenges with diagnosing and issues with diagnosing personality disorders is that there is a large degree of overlap. Yeah, research has found, like for example, between borderline and narcissistic personality disorder, that there's a lot of covariance, as well as with schizotypal and schizoid. Yeah, but we'll draw the distinctions, and they are still considered distinct categories. Yeah, mental disorders. We won't be going so much into the impulse control disorders. I think I touched on this. Um, I know that I touched on this in the substance disorders. Alrighty. And I'm going to be leaving kind of an overview of the etiology and treatment to you guys in terms of what's presented in the text and in the PowerPoints. Alrighty, so a personality disorder. Yeah. Well, first of all, what is a personality? Let's take a step back. Yeah. As a general matter, personality is defined as a relatively pervasive way of thinking, feeling, and behaving in the environment. Okay, relatively pervasive way of all those things, thinking, feeling, and behaving. Yeah, relatively meaning that we all have a certain style or manner. Yeah, maybe being introverted or extroverted, but certainly they may vary depending on the circumstances. Yeah, we may be particularly extroverted at work, and we may be particularly laid back, far more laid back at home, or when we're at temple or church or mosque. Yeah, or vice versa. Sometimes people really come out in temple, church, or mosque, but they're way more laid back, or maybe particularly professional and orderly at work. Yeah, whereas church, temple, mosque, frees them up. They feel like they're part of their community, so they may be more social. Yeah, um, and so we're talking about relatively pervasive ways of behaving. All right. Now, personality disorders refer to an excessively rigid and maladaptive pattern of behavior and ways of relating to others. Okay. So people have a certain style. Everyone has a certain style to one degree or another. Yeah. Um, but with personality disorders, their style, one, is not working so swell in their social and probably their occupational functioning as well. But it's also characterized by being really rigid. Yeah. So they have a way of doing things and they kind of repeat it. Yeah. Regardless of how it's affecting others. Yeah. Borderline personality is arguably, the complete opposite of that. Yeah. Where it's characterized by an inconsistency in a sense of self and personality, but that it's like that's its consistency is its inconsistency. Right, for most of us being inconsistent happens now and then, right? If we're in a particularly bad mood or something really stressful happens, we'll probably act a little atypical from our normal mode of operating. That happens, and we understand that. Yeah, it's actually kind of striking how people still kind of rely on their personality style. Yeah, being conscientious or being particularly warm, even when they're stressed or under certain, difficult situations. It's amazing how people kind of rely on their kind of big five characteristics. Yeah, but we certainly see people depart from their basic big five characteristics under certain, very difficult circumstances, and we kind of understand that. Yeah, with a personality disordered individual, even under those extreme circumstances, yeah, at work or with family and friends, they adhere to a very rigid style of managing things, or not really managing it, but attempting to manage their lives. Now, personality disorders are often referred to as egosyntonic. Yeah, it's kind of an um, old term. And what syntonic refers to is to the extent that one's behaviors, yeah, are um, are consistent with their perceptions of themselves and their attitudes and beliefs. Yeah. Dystonic is when we act in a way which is contrary to our attitudes or beliefs or how we think we are, should be, or would like to be. Yeah. So that's why mood disorders, right? Major depression is usually experienced as something that's ego dystonic. Yeah. People don't feel like it's consistent with who they are or who they want to be and or who they want to be. Okay, so it causes them distress. It's dystonic. It's inconsistent. Yeah. Whereas those who are suffering from personality disorders, their symptoms, which they don't recognize as symptoms, but other people recognize as symptoms, are egosyntonic. Yeah, they're being dramatic or being perfectionistic. Yeah, is seen as something consistent with who they are and or who they want to be. We're going to be looking at three kind of what's referred to as clusters of personality disorders. First, the odd and eccentric. These are 10, you can kind of think of these as the funny personality disorders, sometimes not so funny to some people. The second are the dramatic, emotional, or erratic personality disorders. Now, these are the ones that can kind of scare people, yeah, because of the intensity of the emotions, or, you know, so, sometimes the aggressivity or the violent nature of behaviors associated with these personality disorders. So you can kind of think of these as the scary personality disorders. And finally, the third cluster is the anxious or fearful personality disorders. Yeah, so these are the ones where the particular behaviors or characteristic traits are very kind of sad to see, because you see people are just very afraid to be with people and, are particularly withdrawn, and you can see that they're in pain. Yeah, so it's kind of sad to see this. Yeah. But oddly enough, I just want to kind of reiterate the point. Their style of withdrawing, yeah, is egocentric for them. It's not, they're not feeling like, oh, I should be different, but they are feeling, in terms of how they are with people, they feel like, hey, they're right in what they're doing. But at the same time, you can see that they're suffering, that they're not happy with their circumstances. Okay. Not that the others are very happy with their circumstances, but for the anxious and fearful personality disorders, yeah, unlike someone that's just say, who's social phobic, yeah, in the anxiety disorders, that person wants to be at parties, they want to make friends, they want to date more. Okay, so they're being social phobic is dystonic, whereas the one who is, anxious or fearful as a personality disorder, when they withdraw, they think it's fine to withdraw, that it's justified, and that it fits with who they are. Yeah. At the same time, they do recognize that it's causing them problems. Yeah. So that's what makes it real difficult to treat these disorders, getting back to the syntonic nature of it. Yeah. Because unlike all, probably most, if not all, the other mental disorders, which are dystonic to people, that's the thing that motivates people to one degree or another, right? Things can be dystonic and someone's not motivated to change, but very often that's your hook. Yeah, it doesn't fit with who they see themselves as or who they want to be. So they're motivated, they want to change, more or less. All right, at least you have a door. But when it's egosyntonic, it makes treatment very difficult, because the problem of the symptoms isn't with them, right? It fits with who they think they are, they should be. It's with everybody else, right? It's kind of their problem. And oddly enough, that's very often what brings people to treatment, not because they want to come to treatment, but because family, loved ones, maybe even a work setting is saying, hey, you got to get treatment. This is not working for us. All righty, of the odd and eccentric, there are three mental disorders. I'd like to review with you. First is the paranoid personality disorder. Now, this should not be confused with schizophrenia characterized by paranoid delusion. Okay, that's a psychotic disorder. As a personality disorder, it's not psychotic. Okay, but it's characterized by constant mistrust of people. Yeah. So it happens in work, in friendships, in romantic relationships, with family, constant distrust and suspicion of others. Yeah. People like this are often very argumentative. They have a hard time relaxing. They're constantly tense. Yeah. At work and in social situations. They can be the kind of people who kind of lack humor, and they tend to externalize their circumstances. Whatever happens, it's due to somebody else. Yeah, or the lousy work setting, or former lousy friends, and so on. Yeah, folks like this can have a real hard time maintaining friendships. They may, at best, have maybe one or two French friends, but even those friendships may be kind of distant. Not the type of friendships we usually think of, where you regularly see people. Um, and so I want to make it really clear, though, just to repeat, we're not talking about a delusion. Yeah. For the paranoid personality disorder, a lot of their automatic thoughts or beliefs about people are grounded in reality. The kinds of things that can happen with people, are reality and can happen with people, can happen to any of us. But for the paranoid personality disordered individual, they're thinking about these things constantly. Yeah. For example, what would be one? Like in dating, right? Is it possible that someone you're dating might, let's say you're someone you're seriously going out with, like on a steady basis, yeah, and you think it's mutually exclusive, but then they, have a sexual encounter with someone unbeknownst to you, right? That happens in life, right? We know that happens. Do we constantly think that for every single person we may date? Probably not. Do some people? Yeah. And certainly the paranoid person. Now, there are some people who think that and they're not paranoid personality disorder, but someone who suffers paranoid PD, personality disorder. So I'm not repeating personality disorder every single darn time. The paranoid PD, they'll think that all the time with every person they date, almost every person, or a variation of that with every friend, with every coworker. That the coworker, every possible, that almost every coworker may be out to get them or is competing with them. Yeah, that's another thing that really characterizes this disorder. Yes, this feeling of competition, socially, intellectually, financially. Yeah, very, very kind of unpleasant way of being. And I have a picture of George Costanza here. If for any of you who are old enough to have enjoyed Seinfeld, George Costanza is a classic example of a paranoid personality disorder. Okay, tends to begin in the teens or early 20s, and that you need to differentiate this from, say, a psychotic disorder. Make sure that it's not something like schizophrenia or some other kind of psychotic disorder, that it's not PTSD, and that someone's distrustful because of a traumatic, um, like a wartime incident or having been assaulted, and so on. And you want to distinguish it from the next two disorders that we'll get to right now. The other type of personality disorder in the eccentric category is the schizoid personality disorder. Alrighty. Now it's called schizoid because early on in the early, probably mid 20th century, yeah, um, this disorder was often seen as some form of schizophrenia. Okay. Now, I want to make it clear it is not on the schizophrenia spectrum disorder category. It's not. It's a personality disorder. But it's so strange that for many people, for the longest time, thought schizoid PD was a just a variation of schizophrenia. Yeah. Now, truth be told, right? Not gonna lie, there is empirical evidence to show, interesting enough, that those who are diagnosable as suffering from this kind of personality disorder, interesting enough, have a higher prevalence of schizophrenia in their family. Alrighty, so there may be some genetic commonality between this personality disorder and having schizophrenia. There may be. Right. That said, they are in different categories. Here, the schizoid has minimal desire for social interaction. Yeah, they're kind of indifferent to praise or even criticism. Yeah, it doesn't phase them too much. It honestly doesn't phase them. Yeah, they seem to be also insensitive to others' feelings. Yeah, and they usually demonstrate a lack of social skills. All righty. This is the kind of you can think of this as extreme introversion. Okay. But for a lot of non-PD introverts, yeah, a lot of non-PD introverts, not most, I don't know what the numbers are when it comes to this feeling, but, at times feel like, dude, they wish they were more engaged, right? Um, Many introverts who don't, and good for them. Extroversion is overrated. But for many introverts, they'll at times feel like, hey, maybe I should be going out more, having more friends, and so on. And maybe they don't need to. That's absolutely fine. But you can think of this as extreme introversion, right? Kind of. Here's a joke. It's no small joke though. Think of the image of the guy who lives out in a cabin, out in the woods, and is absolutely fine and happy as a clam, fine and dandy. Well, that's probably a schizoid individual. Yeah. Again, it's egocentric to be alone and not engage with people. It's often related, but what they don't have is kind of odd thinking that you often get with more um, in the other category with schizophrenia, right? So they don't demonstrate odd thinking. Okay. But if they, like, for example, if a family member dies and they don't attend the funeral, right? Someone might say, hey, why didn't you come to Uncle Fred's funeral? And the schizoid person might say, you've known him since for years. We went to those family picnics every year. Um, and for 20 years. And the schizoid person will say, oh, well, I had some work to do, right? With that kind of affect, with that minimal amount of emotional investment. Yeah. And, and it's not defensive. It's not like they're hiding it or trying to be cool or what they really just don't feel the necessity. Yeah. Or that sense of attachment. Okay. So that's schizoid personality disorder. Now, schizotypal personality disorder, like schizoid, early in the 20th century was often thought to be a form of schizophrenia. It's not. Again, separate categories, just like schizoid. Okay, but it has kind of a bizarre quality which makes you think of schizophrenia. And actually, like schizoid, there's been some studies to find a greater prevalence of schizophrenia in family members of individuals suffering from schizotypal personality disorder. Now, with that, I'd like to share with you yet again another DSM bedtime story. All righty. So, this is a story of wash before wearing. All righty. So, this is the story of a 41-year-old man who was referred to a community mental health center's activities program for help in improving his social skills. He had a lifelong pattern of social isolation with no real friends and spent long hours worrying that his angry thoughts about his older brother would cause his brother harm. Yeah, kind of interesting, right? Kind of odd thinking there. He had previously worked as a clerk in civil services, but had lost his job because of poor attendance and low productivity. On interview, the patient was distant and somewhat distrustful. He described in elaborate and often irrelevant detail his rather uneventful and routine daily life. He told the interviewer that he had spent an hour and a half in a pet store, deciding which of two brands of fish food to buy and explain their relative merits. Hmm. For 2 days, he had studied the washing instruction on a new pair of jeans. And he asked himself, uh, did the instruction, quote, wash before wearing, mean that the jeans were to be washed before wearing for the first time? Or did they need, for some reason, to be washed each time before they were worn again? He did not regard concerns such as these as senseless, though he acknowledged that the amount of time spent thinking about them might be excessive. He described how he often would buy several different brands of the same item, such as different kinds of can openers, and then would keep them in their original bags in his closet, expecting that at some future time he would find them useful. He was, however, usually very reluctant to spend money on things that he actually needed, although he had a substantial bank account. He could recite from memory his most recent monthly bank statements, including the amount of every check and the running balance as each check was written. He knew his balance on any particular day, but sometimes got anxious if he considered whether a certain check or deposit had actually cleared. A little OCD there, interesting enough. He asked the interviewer whether, if he joined the program, he would be required to participate in groups. He said that groups made him very nervous because he felt that if he revealed too much personal information, such as the amount of money that he had in the bank, people would take advantage of him or manipulate him for their own benefit. All right, kind of an odd fellow. Yes, with the can opening, all various brains of can openers on the remote chance that it might actually come in handy. All righty. Now, you may have noticed there are times he sounded schizoid, like the personality disorder we mentioned before. The big difference, though, was if you notice later when he was asking about the what sounds like I think a day, kind of a day hospital, yeah, psychiatric day hospital, not where he stays overnight, but he comes in for some rehabilitative work. When he asked about groups, he was anxious about groups, right, because of fears that they would manipulate him. Okay, schizoid person wouldn't care one way or another, and they probably wouldn't go to group because they wouldn't see any value in it. All right, but the schizotypal person would have that kind of odd thinking, just like with buying all the brands of can openers or spending, a couple hours thinking about which kind of pet food to get. Just when was the last time you ever heard someone spending that much time in a pet store about pet food? Okay. The difference, though, is that so it sounds very odd, right? It sounds schizophrenia ish. But the thing with the person with schizotypal personality disorder is that the reality testing is usually intact. Yeah, they're not delusional, they're not hallucinating. Yeah, they may demonstrate superstitious or paranoid thinking. Like the closest one was, his thoughts about his brother and that these thoughts might actually harm his brother. Right? To what extent is that psychotic? Yeah. In this case, because we're talking about it as schizotypal probably, but it that's one of the things you'd have to assess further. Yeah, if this was a real patient of yours. Yeah. But to the extent this is a schizotypal personality, it's not atypical. It is atypical for someone to think that way, but it's not atypical for someone to be for schizotypal to be that superstitious. Yeah. They often have difficulties in their relationships. Other ways that schizotypal personalities come across young, and not in the good way. Kind of in the they were like stuck at age 12 or 13. Yeah, they may dress that way. They may really talk a lot about hobbies and stuff, which are kind of childlike, and come across as immature, but they don't perceive it that way. Okay. Um, so, and I have a picture of Kramer here, again from Seinfeld. And Kramer is an excellent example of a schizotypal personality. Yeah. Like setting up a screen door in his apartment building, right? Instead of taking out his door and putting in a screen door because he wanted the welcoming warmth of a suburban home. So he has a screen. Well, you got to see it maybe to appreciate that joke. Things like that. Alrighty, let's talk about the dramatic, emotional, or erratic personality disorders. Okay, first of all, let's talk about antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder, regrettably, is not as rare as we would like. About 1% of the population may suffer from APD. Yeah, antisocial personality disorder. That sounds teeny weeny, but it's not. If you think about 300, what what's the US population? 275 million? 1% of that? That's a lot of antisocial personality disordered people. Okay, it's characterized by failure to conform to norms and the law, uh, lying, being deceitful, being impulsive, yeah, with sexual aggressive impulses, being irritable and aggressive, a reckless disregard for others' feelings and safety, physical safety, um, consistent irresponsibility in terms of financial, sexual, aggressive behaviors. And here's a big one: lack of remorse. Okay, a lack of ability to empathize. And then when causing harm and hurting others, um, not feeling bad about it, feeling entitled to whatever they did, whatever sexual violent impulse they acted on. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, maybe no, maybe I didn't mention before. I mentioned this in probably a forensic lecture. But here's a good point, time to mention this. What um, what distinguishes antisocial personality disorder from, say, a sociopath? Now, granted, I just want to make it clear: people use these terms, including clinical psychologists, all the time. Okay. An important distinction to make is this. And I think this is the best way to clarify how to think about the two. Okay. Because they are distinct. Okay. Um, Antisocial personality disorder is very broad. So you can think of it as a broad umbrella of, a type of problem. APD is a problematic mental disorder. But if you look at these 7 symptoms, yeah, they cover a lot of different things. Okay, so you can think of it as kind of this broader category. When you hear the term sociopath, yeah, it usually refers to a circumscribed uh, grouping under that category of APD. Yeah. And what it really refers to are many of these characteristics, but particular characteristics that are associated with Cleckley's framework for what a sociopath is. Okay. Now, Cleckley in the probably, I think it was in the 50s, maybe 60s, um, wrote a very classic book on sociopathy called The Mask of Sanity. Now, it's called The Mask of Sanity because what Cleckley posited is that sociopaths can put on a mask where they look normal, right? Where they look sane. They could fake being human, but well, they are human beings, but in terms of psychologically being human. Because for Cleckley, what he reported were individuals who had no real had a sense of not appreciating human emotions. Yeah, and for Cleckley, a hallmark um, feature of the sociopath is a lack of empathy or lack in which results in a lack of remorse and this broader global sense of not um, being able to appreciate, understand, or have the subjective experience of human emotions. Yeah. Besides, primitive drives like sexual drives or violent, aggressive drives. Besides those, yeah, in terms of the broader spectrum of human emotions and subtle emotions, sociopaths can experience that. Will articulate not being able to experience that when they'll tell you that. Alrighty, so that's kind of the idea. APD being the broader umbrella, sociopathy being, you know, uh, of a kind of a subgroup of that, which have hallmark features of sociopath as suggested by Cleckley. Alrighty, antisocial behaviors may occur before age 15, very typically in children suffering from conduct disorder. Okay, but you cannot diagnose someone with APD until they reach, unless they're 18 or older. Alrighty, why? And also as a general rule with personality disorders, yeah. Now you can, many of the other personality disorders do not have this clear criterion that you have to be 18 and older, okay? But as a general rule, clinicians usually think about, usually avoid diagnosing a PD until someone is 18 or over as a general rule. But as a clear rule, a specific rule, criterion that has to be met, you can't diagnose someone as suffering from APD unless they're 18 and older. Okay, the idea with that general rule and the specific criterion is that you want to take into account adolescent development and how personality can really change in adolescence and usually doesn't become more stable until people are 18 and older. Okay, for some it's more like early 20s and older, but for the time being it's 18 and older. Alrighty then, so that's antisocial personality. Jeffrey Dahmer, clear example of a sociopath. We won't get into uh, Jeffrey Dahmer. Manifestations of APDs, many aren't criminals. Okay, many are. If you, I think studies one done at the LA County Jail, found that upwards of 40% of those incarcerated suffer from APD. Alrighty. Doesn't mean that they're not legally obligated to be in jail or prison, but that's no big surprise. Okay, but outside of jail, in terms of who is APD, less than half are criminals. Okay, a very small percentage are like the Jeffrey Dahmers, uh, John Wayne Gacy's, or the Ted Bundys. All right, the true collectively sociopaths. Okay. Interesting enough, the prevalence of APD tends to decrease after age 40. Okay. But not the underlying traits. Yeah. So things that decrease typically after 40 is breaking the law, physical aggressivity, sexual aggressivity. That tends to almost age out, not completely. Yeah. But much less so after young adulthood. Yeah. And as aside from DSM and abnormal psychology, just when it comes to violent behavior, usually by men, yeah, it tends to increase between eight. It tends to be at its highest between 18 and 24. Yeah, and right about 24, no big surprise, when the frontal lobe develops, right, you see a big dive in a violent behavior. Alrighty, and certainly by 40, it's decreases significantly. All right, but for those who are diagnosed as APD, even though the breaking the law and the other violent or sexually violent behavior decreases significantly, many of the underlying personality styles, right, like deceit and being manipulative, will still be there. It'll just play out in a less violent, less law breaking kind of fashion. Alrighty then, let's continue with the next kind of erratic, kind of dramatic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. Okay, prevalence rates can be between 1 to 2%, I believe, offhand. So fairly common. If you're a mental health practitioner, you're bound to run into people who are diagnosed or suffer from borderline personality disorder. Okay. Well, one of the things I think is important to note, yeah, and you can say this about many mental disorders, but I think particularly relevant and true with borderline, yeah, is that at any time in most of our lives, yeah, all of us, we all have the potential to have borderline moments. Yeah. Now, many of us, only a few of us actually probably are diagnosable as suffering from borderline PD. Yeah. But what's really important to keep in mind is that the features, the characteristics of borderline PD is something that many of us, if not almost all of us, may experience at some point in our lives when given sufficient stressor, interpersonal conflict. Okay. Before continuing, I'm just going to pause for a moment, take a little breatherino, and be right back. Okay, with that, thank you, folks, and let us continue. Alrighty. So, to begin our discussion of borderline personality, let me share with you yet another DSM bedtime story. Alrighty. Disco Die. Now, in this story, we have Diana Miller, who's age 25, entered a long term treatment unit of a psychiatric hospital after a serious suicide attempt. Alone in her enormous suburban house with her parents away on vacation, depressed and desperately lonely, she made herself a Valium and Scotch cocktail, drank it, and then called her psychiatrist. Diana had been a tractable child with a mediocre school record until she turned age 12. Then her disposition, which had been cheerful and outgoing, changed drastically. She became demanding, sullen, and rebellious, shifting precipitously from a giddy euphoria to tearfulness and depression. She took up with a quote unquote fast crowd, became promiscuous, abused marijuana and hallucinogens, and ran away from home at 15 with a 17-year-old boy. 2 weeks later, having eluded the private investigators her parents had hired, the two returned. She entered school. She re-entered school, but dropped out for good in her junior year of high school. Her relationships with men were stormy, full of passion, unbearable longing, and violent arguments. She craved excitement and would get drunk, dance wildly on tabletops and discos, leave with strange men, and perhaps have sex in their cars. If she refused their sexual advances, she was sometimes put out onto the street. After one such incident at 17, she made her first suicide attempt, cutting her wrist severely, which led to her first hospitalization. After her first hospitalization, Diana was referred to a therapist for intensive, twice weekly dynamic psychotherapy, for which she had little aptitude. She filled up most of her sessions with a litany of complaints against her family, from whom she expected 100% attention. She called her therapist several times a day about one crisis or another. Mm. During her long period of unsuccessful outpatient treatment, punctuated by several brief hospitalizations, she had many symptoms. She was afraid to travel even to her doctor's office without one of her parents. She was depressed with suicidal preoccupations and feelings of hopelessness. She drank excessively and used up to 40 milligrams per day of Valium. She had eating binges followed by crash diets to get back to her normal weight. She was obsessed with calories and with the need to have her food cut into particular shapes and arranged on her plate in a particular manner. If her mother failed to comply with these rules, she had tantrums, sometimes so extreme that she broke dishes and had to be physically restrained by her father. Alrighty. Diana has never worked except for a few months as a receptionist in her father's company. She has never had an idea of what she wants to do with her life, apart from being with a quote romantic man, close quotes. She has never had female friends, and her only source of solace is her dog. She has often been, quote, eaten alive, close quote, with boredom. Okay, ooh, classic experience for borderline. Efforts by her therapist to set limits have had little effect. She refused to join Alcoholics Anonymous or attend a day program or vocational rehab center, regarding them as quote unquote beneath her. Instead, she languished at home, grew more depressed and agoraphobic, and escalated her Valium use to 80 milligrams per day. It was a serious suicide if it was a serious suicide attempt this time that led to her no, current seventh psychiatric hospitalization. All right, great fact pattern that really kind of captures the experience of being suffering from borderline PD. Yeah, some of the major characteristics as seen in Disco Die was an instability in very aspects of daily functioning, with relationships, work, mood, and so on. Um, One of the things that didn't come out so much was a instability in self-image. There was some degree of consistency here in that, Disco Di seeing herself as wanting to, be this party person and in going through multiple relationships and so on. Um, another way this can manifest itself is a individual who's constantly shifting what they want to do. Right, one moment they'll say they want to go to med school, then 2 weeks later they'll say they want to be a Hollywood stunt person, and so on. Yeah, and then the next week they might want to be a priest. Alrighty. So that's one of the ways you see borderline PD kind of manifests itself. It is a lot of variation in self-image. Suicidal and self-mutilating behavior, very common, very pervasive dysphoria as well. We saw with disco die, hopelessness. Okay. Um, Self-mutilation, cutting behavior, right, to cope with stress. As many of you are familiar, yeah, one of the functions of cutting behavior, yeah, sometimes there may be small cuts made on some part of the body which won't be visible to many people so that the person can participate or perform the cutting behavior multiple times. It's done in a way that others can't see it. Like, for example, it may be done at the ankle, and so on, where someone can just pull up their socks and no one will see that. But why is this behavior performed? Yeah. Well, for many individuals who participate in this kind of behavior, they often will describe that the physical pain of feeling that they get from cutting helps them feel alive or connected, yeah, with reality. Because many of these individuals will feel disconnected from their feelings or not real, but the cutting behavior kind of like yanks them back in to reality or feelings, yeah. And that's kind of um, that is kind of, well, certainly it's a concerning behavior, but it's just so fascinating that someone would feel so disconnected from emotions and the real world that they feel that they have to yank themselves back in some way by doing something of this sort. Yeah. Although cutting behavior and suicide attempts are two different things, yeah, they often go hand in hand. Yeah. And even though they are two different things, the cutting behavior clearly is a serious matter as well. Yeah. And although may not be a suicide attempt, certainly it's dangerous for someone to be, cutting into their skin, because of possible infection and so on. Yeah. Let's see. There's also this phenomenon of splitting. Yeah. And splitting refers to the tendency for those suffering from borderline personality to see things in extremes. Yeah. So splitting may occur, for example, like seeing two people, like parents, one being all good, the other all bad. Yeah. Or, one moment seeing a single individual as being super just wonderful, and then 2 weeks later, because of a difference, let's say an opinion or an argument, seeing the person as all bad, right? So this inability to kind of integrate feelings about people and situations, usually people, in a more complex manner. Yeah, that they're either all good or all bad. Yeah. Um, it's often associated with substance abuse, promiscuity. Um, Here are some individuals who've been characterized as suffering from borderline PD: Marilyn Monroe, Lawrence Arabia, Hitler. Um, okay. Um, Very difficult condition to treat for the reasons I think it's clear in terms of the behavioral problems. Yeah. But if there is a hook, the hook is that those who are suffering from borderline personality are suffering. Yeah. Which is kind of clear with some of the symptoms and behaviors just described. Yeah. And there are effective uh, cognitive behavioral treatments. Yeah. To help those suffering from borderline personality. Histrionic personality, I'm going to kind of bypass this, but it is a personality disorder characterized by being attention seeking, being overly dramatic, superficially charming and gregarious. Alrighty. Um, and this kind of style won't work for most people most of the time after a while. Okay. Can often be confused for borderline personality. But what you won't get as much with the histrionic is that, you know, um, uh, shifts in sense of self, that kind of splitting. You won't see that as much. Yeah. And with that, not nearly as much with the maybe substance abuse, suicide attempts, and so on. Yeah. So it doesn't have those really important components usually. Narcissistic personality disorder. Alrighty. This is a personality disorder characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance. Yeah, believing that one is, immensely intelligent or immensely beautiful, immensely popular. And related to that is this desire to be with other people who they perceive as immensely intelligent, beautiful, or popular. Alrighty, there's a manipulative component with those who suffer from narcissistic PD. Yeah, they often demonstrate grandiose beliefs and attitudes about themselves and those who they wish to associate with, and are self-absorbed with fantasies of success, power, and beauty. And that's what life's about for them. Yeah, acquiring those kudos, those merit points in beauty, intelligence, and success. Yeah, but it's clearly related to a fragile sense of self. Yeah, those who suffer from narcissistic personality are extremely sensitive to criticism, and those who differ with them. Yeah, and when encountering these situations, will often resort to extreme anger. Yeah, sometimes aggressivity. Physical aggressivity in some instances. Yeah, there's this constant need for approval and admiration. Yeah. So that is the narcissistic personality disorder. And as you can see, as we're talking about borderline and histrionic and now NPD, yeah, you can see how there is a large degree of overlap in the symptoms. Yeah. Um, so that's what you want to be really careful with, and sometimes it can be tricky to determine what personality, if someone's suffering from a personality disorder, which one they're actually suffering from. Now, of the anxious and fearful, right? So now we're getting to the third category of personality disorder. It's just avoidant personality disorder, which is characterized by no big surprise, avoiding people and experiences, um, and even people from the past, right? Old childhood friends, old family friends. And it's driven by this fear, intense fear of looking foolish and being judged by others. Yeah, there is this powerful need, not like the narcissistic personality disorder, for approval from others. Yeah, but unlike the NPD will go out there, right? Will put themselves out there, right? Because they think they're beautiful or wonderful, and so on, and to be meet other beautiful, wonderful people. The avoidant personality disorder, although desiring this approval, won't have that perception of themselves, yeah, but certainly will still have a powerful need for approval and acceptance from others, yeah. But because of the fear of being judged or failing in that, they end up avoiding people. Alrighty, this can look like agoraphobia, so you want to make sure it's not that, or just a simple social phobia. Yeah, social phobia is readily treatable. Avoidant personality disorder, not so much so. Okay, again, not again, yeah, again, because the avoidant behavior is syntonic, yeah, with their sense of self. It's like they kind of determine, hey, I'm going to be judged. It's smart for me to avoid people. Why would I do that? Right. But like social phobia, right, it is powerfully negatively reinforced because by staying in, by not making friends, by not dating, right, they avoid any chance of rejection, uh, or someone judging them. And that's a powerful negative reinforcer. Dependent personality, another disorder in this third category of anxious or fearful disorders, is characterized by dependence on others, yeah, for their approval, but it goes even further. Yeah, looking to others to help them make decisions and initiate action. Yeah, it's as if the person needs almost like a parental permission or assistance. Yeah, so people like this will often turn to others, coworkers, friends, uh, for helping them make decisions. Right? They'll make decisions based on what others say, out of fear that, of initiating their own decisions. Yeah. Um, and sometimes folks who are dependent personality disorders, they'll tolerate a high level of psychological or even physical abuse. Yeah, because of the need to have somebody, to need to have that other person guide them or validate them, and so on. Yeah. Another thing, this isn't in the DSM, but it's often just on an anecdotal level. It's kind of interesting, that you may observe with someone who suffers from dependent PD, is that although part of the presentation is being helpless, like, and seeking help, right, from authority figures, from those who are perceived as having power or exerting power, right, there's often this helplessness presented, like, oh, I don't know, I can't do it, I'm scared, please help me. But at the same time, ironically, right, they do exert power because they know who to go to, and they know how to kind of talk to the right person to get things done. They just talk to the right person to for assistance, for help, out of a guise of helplessness, yeah, and fear. But at the same time, they kind of often can get things done their way, right, by manipulating people this way. It's not often a conscious, um, it's often not a consciously uh, um, determined kind of behavior. Yeah. But to a third party, after a while, you see the person who's ostensibly afraid and helpless, and you kind of look and you go, well, they're kind of getting their way a lot, but through other people helping them. Alrighty. What is the obsessive compulsive personality disorder? Not the disorder. We already discussed that in a previous chapter. But what is the personality disorder? Yeah, and there is a difference. So, for to elucidate that, let us look at the case of the workaholic. Alrighty, so where is that case of the workaholic? Here we go. The workaholic. So, the patient is a 45-year-old lawyer who seeks treatment at his wife's insistence. Personality disorder. She is fed up with their marriage. She can no longer tolerate his emotional coldness, rigid demands, bullying behavior, sexual disinterest, long work hours, and frequent business trips. The patient feels no particular distress in his marriage and has agreed to the consultation only to humor his wife. It soon develops, however, that the patient is troubled by problems at work. He is known as the hardest driving member of a hard driving law firm. He was the youngest full partner in the firm's history and is famous for being able to handle many cases at the same time. Lately, he finds himself increasingly unable to keep up. He is too proud to turn down a new case and too much of a perfectionist to be satisfied with the quality of work performed by his assistants. Displeased by their writing style and sentence structure, he finds himself constantly correcting their briefs and therefore unable to stay abreast of his schedule. People at work complain that his attention to detail and inability to delegate responsibility are reducing his efficiency. Right? He has had two or three secretaries a year for 15 years. No one can tolerate working for him for very long because he is so critical of any mistakes made by others. When assignments get backed up, he cannot decide which to address first, starts making schedules for himself and his staff, but then is unable to meet them and works 15 hours a day. Wow. He finds it difficult to be decisive now that his work has expanded beyond his own direct control. The patient discusses his children as if they were mechanical dolls, but also with a clear underlying affection. He describes his wife as a, quote, suitable mate, close quote, and has trouble understanding why she is dissatisfied. He is punctilious in his manners and dress and slow and ponderous in his speech, dry and humorless, with a stubborn determination to get his point across. The patient is the son of two upwardly mobile, extremely hardworking parents. He grew up feeling that he was never working hard enough, that he had much to achieve and very little time. He was a superior student, a quote unquote bookworm, awkward and unpopular in adolescent social pursuits. He has always been competitive and a high achiever. He has trouble relaxing on vacations, develops elaborate activity schedules for every family member, and becomes impatient and furious if they refuse to follow his plans. He likes sports, but has little time for them and refuses to play if he can't be at the top of his form. He is a ferocious competitor on the tennis courts and a poor loser. Alrighty, so that is a great example of an obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now you can see there are components of OCD, yeah, with the work and perfectionism, with grammar and sentence structure, with people he's working with, yeah. But you can see it's far broader than that. Yeah, it has to do. It kind of sounds like the paranoid personality disorder, right? In terms of the competitive quality, right? He can't lose. But it also is very much characterized by this global need to control things. Yeah. Uh, eh, so his fellow workers, his work performance. Yeah. But it's a control gone awry, right? In his attempts to control circumstances, sounds like a Buddhist lesson here, right? He's actually losing control. People don't want to work with him. He's being perceived as inefficient and so on. Yeah, very classic kind of pattern. Just as on an anecdotal point, this is not a DSM criterion, but people who try to control so much, right? Their family members, their coworkers, their relationships, right? Almost treating them like objects, right? And not understanding why they may not be happy, right? Because he got a nice home, he brings in a lot of money. Why wouldn't they be content? Such a powerful need to control things, but then failing, right, in those attempts. Okay, they're very critical of others. They choose work over relationships, um, and they tend to. And one thing that characterizes the workaholic is procrastination. Yeah, and why is that? Yeah, because one of the things that often goes hand in hand with procrastination is perfectionism. All righty. Those who see, now it's good to want to do good work, right? And certainly we can praise the craftsperson who wants to make the perfect vase or perfect painting, right? And the person who dots their I's and cross their T's. All righty. But the person who's so obsessive about it, gets so painfully angry when there's failures at themselves or at others, with the OC PD, it's usually others, right? That perfectionism actually leads people to put things off until the last moment, to procrastinate. They often show a limited range of emotional expression, except anger. Not so, and but as kind of shown in obsessive compulsive in workaholic, the case of workaholic, right? This kind of constricted range of emotions. Alrighty, but to be clear, they do not experience the the obsessive thoughts like an OCD, or the compulsive behavior like washing hands 86 times that we see in OCD. So that is workaholic. Okay. Now, what are some of the problems with diagnosing someone with a personality disorder? Okay. Well, it's one of the things it's not so clear is whether these mental disorders are separate, distinct categories, or are they actually dimensions along a different construct? Yeah. Are things like borderline, narcissistic, histrionic PD actually just different dimensions of another construct? Okay. And that's still debated and disputed. Okay. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish a personality disorder from a non-personality disorder. Yeah. So what is the difference between obsessive compulsive PD versus OCD? Okay. Now I think we just a moment ago drew out some of those distinctions. Yeah, but you can see how it can be kind of tricky after a while. Yeah. Like even with the workaholic, right? The thing, how he responded to grammatical or sentence problems, or having three, 2 to 3 secretaries every year, different secretaries every year, because he, was so compulsive. So at what point is it actually an OCD? And sometimes it can be very tricky. I think with workaholic, we have this larger global problem of wanting control and to, exert power over people. Yeah. Um, there's a lot of overlap among the personality disorders, as we just discussed. Same thing, kind of just discussed earlier. Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between normal and abnormal behavior. Yeah. The thing with workaholic. Yeah. How many of us may know lawyers who are very similar to workaholic? Yeah. So to what extent? Now, a lot of the lawyers who may work that way, though, at home can be very different. And that's probably what's the case in most situations, right? That's why the lawyer who might look like workaholic in the law firm might really still enjoy and desire and will take their 2 week vacation, right? Because they need that in their lives too. Or their family lives are absolutely fine and they don't do that to family. Yeah. Again, it's that rigid quality where what you do with the law firm, you do unto family, right? Treating, like in workaholic, treating the children like objects. Yeah. Um, and you also want to avoid confusing labels with explanations. Yeah. So when you hear the term borderline personality disorder, yeah, or dependent personality disorder, so what causes that? Yeah. What is theoretically, yeah, some of the causative factors or etiological factors for borderline, for dependent personality? Alrighty. And it's tempting to just rely on a circular explanation, right? Borderline was, because of disrupted sense of self, right? Lack of integration, right? Well, is that really a theoretical explanation or is that a circular explanation? Alrighty. If you say dependent personality is because, of a family dependent on parents, right? Family history of dependence. Well, all right, maybe that's the case, but does that really explain the causative variables leading to dependent personality? Or again, is that a circular explanation? And, yeah, personality disorders tend to be long term. So it's just saying that is because of dependent childhood, dependence on childhood figures, and, you know, um, dependence on parents during childhood, is that a causative explanation or is just a description of dependent personality disorder. And the other thing we got to be very careful with, this goes for all mental disorders, but certainly the personality disorders are particularly vulnerable to this, are sexist biases. Yeah. Borderline personality um, disorders tend to be, there's research to suggest that people may be, that clinicians are biased towards diagnosing women as suffering from borderline personality disorder, but diagnosing men who demonstrate the same features, but simply by virtue of the fact that they're male, don't get diagnosed as suffering from borderline personality disorder, but they may be more diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder, yeah, or something else, yeah, maybe just called plain violent. Whereas really what the men are some of those men may be suffering from are really an important issue. Borderline personality disorder, suggests that there are some real critical issues that need to be addressed in individuals who suffer from that diagnosis. Okay. Same thing with dependent personality disorder, a tendency to diagnose women as suffering from dependent personality disorder, but maybe not diagnosing men who demonstrate the exact same symptoms with that disorder, but maybe with something else like a mood disorder. Yeah. Or maybe even, um, no, I was thinking of another example, but that would be a bad example. But not being disinclined to diagnose men who demonstrate the same dependent qualities. All righty, and with that, we spoke a lot about the different disorders, personality disorders, what characterizes them, how to distinguish them. Um, and with that, I'm going to stop there. And that ends our discussion on personality disorders. Thank you again for the privilege of your attention. And we will continue with the next chapter in abnormal psych. And until then, see you later. Bye bye.